I think the reason why your question is complicated first is because if you have, say, a 2-year-old and you go to a club that has 5 different swimming pools and one is made for toddlers, you don't really need to be around as much, and you don't need to be as mindful and as observant because the pool is only like 2 inches deep. That's it. And when the pool is about maybe a foot deep, this 2-year-old can probably walk around, splash here and there. The chances of drowning very, very slim, still possible but slim, so you don't need to be as aware and as mindful. If on the other hand, you were to put this tiny little kid into a pool that's about 6 feet deep or even 5 or 4, the truth is you need to be like a cat, very, very mindful, very, very aware, because at any time things could go wrong. So the more depth that lives inside the teacher, or the more depth that lives inside anybody, even if you were to talk about romantic relationships. Let's say after many, many years, you finally come to the conclusion that, well, you know exactly what it is that you want in your companion. You're not an 18-year-old, and you're not simply going to fall into trap because someone looks good or someone talks well. You're hopefully a 50-year-old, very, very seasoned human being. So should anyone desire your time, anyone desire your attention, anyone desire your body, because there are so many complicated layers and all those created by experience, by observation, by making a lot of mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and then making sure that those mistakes have changed you for the better, your companion is going to have a much more difficult time reaching you. So that's number one. So when you speak about teachers, you're talking about people at different stages with different complications, different complexities, and different layers. The more mature, the more experienced, the more observant, the more difficult. And the more difficult, the more demanding. So 2 18-year-olds getting together, they're not going to ask too many things from one another, except just let's go have coffee, let's have sex, and that's it, basically. And after 2, 3, 4, 5 months, you have the creation of all these complex emotions that don't really understand. Eventually things will smell bad and each will go their own way. All of us are students in different ways. Some of you here are a student for a grade. Some of you are here wanting to understand or learn particular things. And so students happen to be very, very selfish in the way they want to learn things and what it is that they want to learn. Given that all students have their own set of experiences, and all experiences create belief systems, and all belief systems create assumptions, all students, all of us, walk around with a lot of assumptions about ourselves, what we want to learn, how we want to learn them. The most important thing is the problem of capacity. All of us in this class imagine that we have a capacity to be in a good, healthy relationship. So we're always looking for a Jesus Christ to walk into our life, because we think that is who we want, and that is our worth. And anything less than that, we're shortchanging ourselves. No student walks into any relationship, on the first date looking at the person sitting the opposite direction saying, listen, I'm really awful. I don't know how to think. I don't know how to be. I've been into like a string of relationships. They're all gone bad because of me. Just letting you know. None of us do that. Unless you happen to be an addict and you've gone to some meetings, and one of the things that you've learned in these meetings is that be honest and be truthful. So 5 minutes into the relationship, you look at your companion and say, listen, before we get started, I just want to tell you, I am 2 weeks sober. But that's not something you walk into as just people who are normal like us. Any relationship, whether it's a teacher-student relationship or a romantic relationship, the first component that's necessary is the element of attraction. Something about you must attract the other person. Without that, it's not going to happen. Now, they need to be attracted to you either physically, if you happen to be like chronically depressed or depressed for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there is something about you that enjoys, relates to telling the same story over and over and over again. So you have to find people who are interested in those kinds of stories. Let me tell you what my dad did. Let me tell you what happened to my first husband and then my second husband. Let me tell you what happened to me. And that makes the conversation interesting. It keeps it going for about 5, 6, 7 hours, maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe years, before you get exhausted and she gets exhausted, perhaps. Some people happen to attract you intellectually. There's just something about the way they use language, there is something about the way they're animated, perhaps, that they attract you. There are some people whose attractive quality is one of silence. They don't really say much, but there's something about them. Maybe it's their body language, maybe it's their eyes, who knows? Maybe it's the way they listen to you, maybe the way they like smile at you or grin at you. But there is something about their presence that captivates you and you don't know what it is. Now, sometimes this element of attraction can be immediate and sometimes it can take time. It's like you hang out with, I don't know, Casera, for example. You don't like her, she doesn't like you. I mean, it's obvious. She just doesn't like anybody, right? And you don't like anybody. As the two of you like take a class together, then do a study together, an hour here, an hour there, little by little, she begins to think about you, you begin to think about her, then emotionally the two of you become entangled. But that's like 4 months into this game. So that's the gradual process, that you don't really like someone, but you don't really mind them being around either. Little by little, emotions grow like a seed. It has all the right nourishments. Sometimes it's instantaneous. You don't know why. And they happen not very often. There is just something about someone and something about you, either physically or emotionally or intellectually or even spiritually, if you believe in those things. It just kind of stands up. I said, that's interesting, okay? And then you build on that. All students have a personality. All personalities have a certain perspective about the way life is, about who they are, what they are, meaning and all those things. Now, I don't know if you've ever sculpted. Now, in sculptures, you can have two kinds of clay. You can either one that's soft or you can have one that's hard. That which has been hardened has either just been an open space, air has gotten into it, and eventually the moisture gets out, and it just becomes this dry, concrete piece of thing, right? The other is you give it a shape, you put it in the oven, it bakes, it cools down, you paint it, and that's it. The only way you can, I suppose, change its structure is by getting a hammer and just smashing it. No student comes to you soft. No one does. The first thing that happens between a teacher and a student, any kind, even if, you have a kid, you know what happens when they say, Dad, I want to make chocolate chip cookies, let me help you. Even though this 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old has zero life experience, right? Nevertheless, they assume that they have the capacity to listen, to grab the knife, to mix various things, to listen, and to do as you have told them. It won't take you very long to realize, yes, your kid was inspired. And that's the other thing you need to understand. There is a stage where a student is inspired. In other words, you come to this class, I say a couple of things, you say, man, I like to go and read some Plato today. That's an inspirational moment. You take your behind to the library, you'll check out 5, 6 books about Plato, you read a couple of lines, and then life gets in, and then time passes, and then you say, oh man, I should have returned this book 2 weeks ago. But you haven't even looked at it for the past 2, 3, 4, 5 months. Okay. So the other thing you need to understand, there are some students who are inspired, and that inspiration is not lasting. There are those students who are inspired, that inspiration gets a good amount of nourishment, i.e. support system, and it turns into you being responsible for the inspiration that took place inside you. These are very, 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 very different. Inspiration is not tough. It's not difficult. Look at the Occupy movement. Look at sometimes you watch, for example, images coming from Palestine. Look at some of the images that enter into you while you're driving home and you watch the homeless, you watch the poor, you watch the hungry, you watch the sick, and something overcomes you. You say, yes, I want to just change my life completely. I want to do a different kind of a thing with my life, be more helpful to other people. These are inspired moments, okay? 10 minutes later you realize, well, you're the Scrooge you've always been. You don't want to part with your money or your time or your energy. You expect a thank you from people, okay? Now, it usually takes a long, long time for this inspiration to mature, where you take this inspiration and you say, you know what, I'm going to be responsible for it. I love this thing that was inspired inside me. Let's say you wanted to do business, you take a philosophy class, all of a sudden you're inspired to do philosophy, but your parents don't have money, you yourself don't have money, and you have to kind of wrestle with this idea. Do I really want to do philosophy? What the hell do people do with philosophy? Nothing. What can you do with a bachelor's? Nothing. What can you do with a master's? possibly going to like being a clergy of sorts, or teaching, or going to some cemetery, talking to the dead or the trees or whatever. Okay, but it's not going to fetch you any money. And so before you drop business or computer science and pursue philosophy, there's a good amount of conflict that lives inside you, because you realize that philosophy is not going to make you rich physically. I mean, maybe rich intellectually, emotionally, but certainly not physically, no money. And then you have to look at your parents, then you have to look at your wife and your kids, and you have to look at your rent, and you have to look at the way your life is it's all a mess, and you want to make it messier by doing philosophy. So before you can actually become inspired and taking that inspiration very, very responsibly, there's a good amount of wrestling that takes place within you. Now, in the Islamic tradition, this is called Jihadul Akbar. It's not very difficult to come over and slap me. But to realize that there are certain things wrong with you. You have, say, temperamental issues. You have certain assumptions about you. You have assumed too many things about your own capacity, where in fact, your capacity to do anything is very, 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 very limited. So that's the punishment that's necessary for you to give to yourself. Look yourself in the mirror and for the first time say, Richard, you are ugly, end of story. There is a reason why no one wants to date you. Now, given that all students approach their teachers in a very solid way, solid in the sense that you're a 35-year-old man, you have certain life experiences. You also assume that you have learned a few things from your experiences. Now, you've also read some books. So you want your teacher to look like Plato, to sound like Plato. Okay? You want your teacher to be as animated as Kierkegaard. You want to look into his eyes, and you want to see what Carlos Castaneda talked when he said a few things about Don Juan. You want the spark in his eyes, or her eyes, usually him. So you have all these fantasies about how a teacher should look. So you are already a baked student. Now, it may be that you're looking for a teacher because you have felt certain poverties about yourself. There are moments you wake up at 2 in the morning and you say, my life is not amounting to anything. Sometimes as you're walking, all of a sudden you are overcome with this very depressive mood where everything just falls apart and you say, life has no meaning. I am married, but I feel alone. I have children, but I feel alone. My bank account is full with cash, but I feel so poor. So there must already be a sense of brokenness about you. Now you assume that you know what this brokenness is all about. And this brokenness is sufficient in making you a really, really good student. Right? So these are all the assumptions you walk into. Now, someone needs to get rid of all of that. Now, here's the problem. I don't know if you've ever been wrongfully evicted or even rightfully evicted. The problem with being pushed out of the space you've occupied for so many years is that every space that you've occupied for a long period of time, it has become a home for you. You have relationships in that space, you have meaning in that space, you have stories in that space. Even if those spaces are filled with negative emotions, even if you know that your father is going to come home drunk, at least you know he's your father and he's going to come home drunk, and from 5 to about 9 p.m. you'll be locked in your room. You'll come out 9:45 when your father is sober. And when your father comes home sober, you have no idea what to do now, because for the past 20 years you've been locking yourself up in your back room. What a teacher is going to do, because what is it that teachers have really? Teachers are like Safeway or Costco's or any other place. They have a merchandise. They don't want this merchandise to be stolen. They don't want this merchandise to be plagiarized, copied and pasted, because they have worked really hard to grow whatever this wisdom is. Because they worked hard to grow it, to nourish it, to protect it, they also want to make sure that it's going to be given to the right hands, to the right person. Now, you don't really know what to do with, like the prodigal son. You have no idea what to do with this wealth. You're going to treat this wealth like any 18-year-old. Your father is going to give you $30,000. Your father is 60, you're 18. What do 18-year-olds do? Well, you're not going to invest in buying a plot of land somewhere, building a house or buying a car, going to school. Well, you're going to do what your surrounding demands. And the surrounding is what? People drink, people smoke, people have sex, people just have fun. They want to live for the moment. I mean, that's really something that Americans are really good at, always spending tomorrow's money today. And so when the 31st comes, your landlord comes and says, where's the rent? You say, I'm so sorry, I wasn't aware and I spent it all on booze, for example. If you look at Indians, if you look at Middle Easterners, if you look at Asians, you realize They always are in the business of saving money, because these people have been poor for such a long time that every time they spend a buck, there is a good amount of regret and punishment, self-inflicting punishment that comes with it. It is true you're spending $4 on a tiny piece of coffee, but you could have made this cup at home for like less than a penny. You spend it nevertheless, but there's a good slap that you give yourself emotionally as well. And so teachers are not going to just give you random things. They want to give you what lives inside them. Now let's just say that what lives inside teachers is what we call wisdom. I don't know what it is. All I know is that wisdom is beyond information, is beyond data, is beyond like piecing together information the right way to make it into a knowledge. Okay, wisdom is something that transcends all the things we have talked about, information, data, and knowledge. Nevertheless, when the student hears it, whenever the student hears a piece of wisdom, they hear information, they hear knowledge. Now, it doesn't mean they're not going to be inspired. They will be inspired, but what they don't really understand is this is a piece of wisdom that has taken like 20 years to simmer, to get cooked. And now what you're getting is this dish that has been in the stove for the past like 20, 30, 40 years. Okay? That's not what the student sees. All the student sees and feels is that, that's a great piece of information. I mean, consider, for example, the effort and the trouble that Saint Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, took in his genealogy. I mean, this is a Jewish gospel given to the converts, the Christians. He has tried so hard to make Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament Messiah. He's a Messiah, he's a rabbi, his genealogy goes back to David, for example. He's just there for the Jewish folks. You just read the book, and it's great. But you have no idea that this author, some like 2,000 years ago, had really a great amount of knowledge about the Old Testament, about how this messianic figure is supposed to come. And then he says to himself, how do I make Jesus look like that? So that's what you need to understand about teachers. Teachers are like honeybees. You know, they travel from land to land, country to country, book to book, flower to flower. And at a certain point in their life, they get really tired of traveling from one book to another, one teacher to another, one idea to another. They sit somewhere and they sit in darkness, in solitude, and hopefully whatever it is that they've experienced for the past 20 years, at a certain point, without their own knowledge, it turns into wisdom. And then they open their mouth and they say, wow, you know what? I can be creative with Kierkegaard. I can be creative with Plato. I can be creative with Jesus. And it happens accidentally. At a certain point, your addiction to information or data, it dies. At a certain point, your addiction to knowledge dies. Now you're looking for something that can be found in books. Okay? You're looking for a living presence, another human being where you can sit, as in the Hindu tradition we call the Upanishad. You sit at the feet of your teacher. Now, feet. You go to the bathroom with it, you walk on dirt with it, and when you sit at the feet of your teacher, not only is it symbolic of humility, but that you have come to realize as a student that you're lower than dirt, lower than dung, that you submit yourself completely to your teacher. And it's no different than when you take a carpentry class, or when you take a physics class or a chemistry class, because these are applied studies. At a certain point, you go into a lab and the teacher says, this is what you got to do to the liquids. And this is the amount of pressure you have to apply to these liquids in these tubes. And says no more, no less. If you do it too more, it's going to explode, you're going to be blind. If you do it too less, you're not going to get the proper results. Okay, so you listen very attentively. Now, given that all teachers desire to give what they have to the students, you know, the idea that you have in the Old Testament, God creates human beings in his own image, well, that's what teachers want. Teachers want to create students into their own image. Now, given the fact that no student enters into the teacher's presence being a moist, wet clay, soft clay, what's going to happen, the teacher at some point has to start breaking the student. Now, there are two ways of breaking the student. You could either be harsh, or first you throw some baits. The student bites into those baits, they get hooked. We call it love. You begin to like the person you're with, then you become infatuated, then you realize the only person whose ideas are interesting for you is the person you're working with. And little by little, something about you softens. Little by little, something about you says, I don't think I know as much. Little by little, you try to understand what your teacher is saying, but you won't. Because students go through different stages of understanding. First, it's all about feelings. Feelings you don't really understand, but you feel nevertheless. Now, as your attraction towards the teacher grows, you become more secluded, more isolated. The only person you want to hang out with is this person and the people around this person. Okay, so your world begins to shrink. Every craft has its own language. You have a 2-year-old, you have a 10-year-old, and you have an 18-year-old. All these 3 different people live in 3 different worlds. These worlds have different desires, different ambitions. They create different emotions, different hurts, which means that you're going to have access to 3 different worlds. If you like your kids and you like to hang out with them, you have to have access to 3 different worlds. You have to know 3 languages, and you have to know the desires that live in this language. So when it comes to your 18-year-old, you said, son, I want to talk to you about smoking. The 10-year-old, for example, I don't know what 10-year-olds do. Let's go to some place where you can jump on trampolines. The 2-year-old, the language of the park, for example. Let's go to Target and buy you a Sonic toy, for example. When it comes to wisdom, there are specific languages that it has, and you won't get that. The only language that you initially understand is the language of feelings and emotions. Now, what's going to happen is, if the teacher has been able to break you, and the problem with breaking is this, you're being evicted. You're being evicted from a house that you've lived in for such a long time. Imagine that you've never enjoyed your father. You've always disliked him. In fact, let's make that, you've always hated him. Now you go to a therapist. Now, what this therapist wants to do is, he or she wants to make peace, at least in your imagination, you and your father. Well, you've grown in this house, in this home, where you've always hated your dad for the past 20 years. And now the therapist is trying to offer you a different perspective. That perspective has different sort of feelings and emotions. It's going to give you a different set of information, and then it's going to give you a different language. So next time you go into his or her office, you're not going to hate. You're not going to say hate. You're going to use a different word. And now there are going to be many times where you're going to slip. Instead of saying I dislike, you're going to say hate. And then you're going to catch yourself. I'm sorry, I meant dislike. Now, dislike even means that there are negative emotions in there. And the task of your therapist is to remove all negative emotions so you can become neutral. Once he or she is able to make your relationship with your father imaginative, intellectually neutral, then you can talk about how mean your father has been for the past 20 years in a way where you're not emotional, but you're detached, you're rational, you're observant, and you speak eloquently about this and articulately. So initially, the first stage is emotions and feelings. You're going to spend maybe 5 or 6 hours a week with your teacher. Then you're going to go back to your life. The problem now is this. Your teacher's world is very, very different than the world given to you by life itself. Your wife, your kids, your job, your classes, your own desires, they're all going to be in conflict with what you're getting from your teacher. At any time, you could break from your teacher and go back to life. Because these 2 things, lion and lamb, they're not going to lay together. It's impossible. There's going to be a good amount of conflict. Now, the only way that this newfound set of emotions and feelings and language are going to survive is by the protection and the support of your teacher. Without the presence of your teacher, it's not going to work out. If you become addicted to what your teacher has to offer, and remember how addiction comes about, is by doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. As you do something over and over again, it begins to occupy more and more space inside you. Now, one of the things you need to understand about teacher-student relationship is the following. Teachers don't desire to only occupy 10% of the space inside you, or 20%, or 30%, or 40%. It's no different than like you going out with Kasera, and every half hour she talks about her ex. And there's a reason why she talks about her ex, because you haven't yet occupied her entire space. So when she's not around you, she still talks about her ex. Maybe she writes in her journal about her ex. Maybe she looks at old pictures. The moment you begin to occupy 70, 80, 90, and ultimately 100%, her ex becomes irrelevant. In fact, every time the phone rings and it is her ex, she dismisses it completely. She's indifferent. She doesn't care. It's you now. So teachers, the idea that you'll get in the Old Testament that God is a jealous God and God is a wrathful God, it's justified and it's valid. It's ought to be that way because something has been injected inside you, right? And that image needs to be protected. And so when you give up that image for another, there is jealousy. When you cheaply give that image away for another image, that makes someone angry. You're a married man, sometimes you see things. We're all in the business of flirting with other people. Sometimes you see your wife's maybe laughing or smiling or just talking very casually to another. Or maybe you do it yourself and you catch yourself. You say, well, if my wife did that, I'd be jealous. One of the things that happens as your teacher occupies more and more intellectual space inside and emotional space inside you is that you will have nothing or almost nothing to talk about with your wife, almost nothing to talk about with your parents. You become very, very, very quiet. Now, if you're a student and you walk into this teacher-student relationship with a life, and by life I mean the following. If you're married, if you have a companion, so as your relationship with your teacher intensifies, چون دایره ما ز پوست پوشان توییم در دایره حلقه به گوشان توییم گر بنوازی ز جان خروشان توییم ور ننوازی هم از خموشان توییم. We have this drum in the Persian world. It has these rings around it. So when you smack it, when you slap it, there's this sound that comes out of it and it's beautiful. And so the student says, I lay flat on the sofa as an instrument. If my teacher slaps me, I will be ecstatic. If anybody else touches me, I won't make a sound. It's only my teacher. Okay? Without the presence of my teacher, I'm going to be completely mute. So that's how your life is going to be for a long, long time. Now, let's talk about what's going to happen to you as a student. There are going to be at times. Now, look, so I got my degrees. I don't need to sit where you're sitting. I don't need to do the assignments that you guys have to do. I don't need to be patient in listening to someone's ridiculous ramblings for an hour and 15 minutes every Monday and Wednesday. I have graduated from those things. Sometimes you're going to go to your teacher's house being really, really angry because nothing about your life is working. Your relationship is about to fall apart. You have no idea what the hell you're talking about. You're confused. You're getting older. You're getting uglier. You're getting sicker and nothing about your life is right. And you say, you know what? My teacher is nothing but a bundle of advertisements. That's what he does. He just tells me, oh, be patient. It'll be okay. Be patient. And now you begin to resent your teacher. Now you become angry at your teacher. Now, you may look at me and say, well, Amir, do you write essays? No. You have no right to be angry at me. I've passed those stages. A teacher is no longer at the stage of accumulating information. A teacher is no longer at a stage where he wants to go around reading books and getting knowledge from them. A teacher no longer needs to sit somewhere quietly for 20 years so this information and knowledge can transform into wisdom. That's not the job of the teacher anymore. The teacher is at will. If you read the synoptic gospels, people ask Jesus a question, he tells a story. That's what they do. They're connected to this umbilical cord. It's invisible. I don't know what it is, but they can just generate ideas at will. And maybe it's on an intuitive level. I don't really know. Now, besides having envy towards your teacher, you're going to have envy towards other people, especially if you have siblings. And one of the nice things about family and being in family gatherings is they have a great knack in making you feel bad about yourself. You know, your brother established, your sister established, they're married, they got like half a dozen kids each, and here you are. You live alone, you're like mostly depressed, confused, angry. You want to be like them, but that's not your territory. Let's just say they really like you, they want to get you engaged in conversations, but it doesn't interest you. به کشت خاطرم جز غم نرویه به باغم جز گل ماتم نرویه به صحرای دل بی حاصل ما گیاه ناامیدی هم نرویه. What they don't really see is that you live in this desert where nothing grows, nothing. You can't even be hopeless anymore. You just sit there. And you've been in it for such a long time, there is no darkness, there is no hopelessness, there is no sadness. You just sit there. You're useless, completely useless. Now, the only refuge and shelter that you have is your teacher's house, no one else. Now, the end result can be one of two things. You either get what you're looking for or what you were looking for at the very beginning, which is wisdom, or you may realize that, no, you're not going to be given that. You just walk around knowing that everything that other people have to offer you, this is junk. You don't know what you're looking for, you don't really know what wisdom looks like, but what you certainly do know is that people don't have it. You may be lucky enough to be one of those people where at the end of 15, 20-year period, one morning you wake up and you have something, and you don't know what it is. If you hang out with Moses, you're going to make you a social activist. If you hang out with Jesus, he doesn't care about social activism. He wants you to go into the desert. Moses says the kingdom of God is creating a harmonious society. Jesus says the kingdom of God lives inside you. Forget society. Just go within and figure that out. If you go to Martin Luther King Jr., he's going to tell you passive engagement. That's how you resist. If you go to someone like Frantz Fanon, he'll probably say, listen, there comes a time where you just got to pick up arms and fight. So the point I'm trying to make is because of the differences in the nature of teachers, what you get in one is not necessarily what you're going to get in another. So if you were to, for example, if Karl Marx was to teach this class, eventually you're going to be like a Karl Marx. I mean, it is true that he talked about Hegel, he loved Hegel, and eventually he walked away from Hegel, but the truth is if you study his philosophy really, really well, you realize Marx's philosophy is no different than Hegel's. It just takes a different approach, that's all.